Yeah, I saw that one and I read it a couple ways. Um, the connections themselves don't actually affect like scores in the grade book per se, but connections are everything. Connections with students are the best part of teaching, and for me, the most important part of teaching, mainly because it gets kids to buy in, and student buy-in is, I think, directly connected to good assessments. Because you get better work from the students. Connections have huge advantages. The students will be more inclined to try. They'll be more inclined to want to know their stake in the learning process versus a teacher that doesn't have great connections with the students. That said, there will be bias. Be aware of it. So, like for instance, the sort of bias I'm talking about is depending what you teach. Like, I'm an English and history teacher, and so you have like the range that you have in those of students that you have in those classes is very noticeable. Like you would know a 90s kid from a 60s kid, if that's the grading scale. I taught secondary, so that's why I'm not using the 1 to 4. But it's very tempting for some teachers to just grade to the standard of the previous work the student's done, and that is something you can't fall into that trap when it comes to assessment, because whatever they previously did, it might not be the same element or outcome as whatever it is you're doing. So just being aware of that and always grading to whatever the standard is that you've created with the rubric, right? Whatever the outcome is asking, that's the standard that they have to be assessed to. But in terms of formative assessments, understanding what that student can do along the way, connections are a huge time saver, because if you have a good connection with the student and you're constantly assessing them formatively, it's very easy to know what that student has done. So you might have seen it. You might have seen a component of an outcome met formatively before, where even if they don't meet it on a particular assignment, within that outcome, you know that it's been done. You've seen it met formatively, so that they can complete that outcome summatively, if that makes sense. So to answer your question, how does it affect them? It affects it hugely, I believe. But there's that sort of line you have to walk between making sure it's not subjectively impacting your objective assessments with summative assessments. I guess it would be constant or oftenly assessing them formatively. So like my big thing in the classroom was I avoided the sage on the stage. I didn't want to be up there lecturing. I didn't want them to have to show up and listen to me talk for a half an hour, because you don't know if they're learning when you're talking. You might think it's awesome to stand up there and just spit facts at students and think that they're retaining it, but there's no way for you to know that. Like they can note take and things like that, but even that's not terribly accurate. So the main goal is it has to be instruction driven and scaffold that instruction so that you're doing it in components. And when you break a bigger task into smaller components through scaffolding, it's much easier to formatively assess each component and break down what the student has been able to do. So even if you have like a mental checklist, or you want to print out a checklist, it's going to be pretty huge though if you have a class of 30 kids. So being able to formatively assess those smaller components day in and day out will allow you to sort of know, okay, well, they didn't actually do that thing in this final iteration of the assessment, but I saw them do it in a draft. I saw them do it on a previous assignment in the same outcome while I was scaffolding, while I was constantly monitoring. So my approach was always get them to the work, and then instruct as I'm working through it. Because if I stand up there for 20 minutes and I talk to the class of 30 and only 5 of those kids actually learn by listening, I've now wasted 25 people's time. So my big thing always was have the instructions written for them, demonstrate it, get them to work so that I can just be moving around the room, working with them one-on-one more so. Yeah. Absolutely. I think that's a terrific question because you're very aware of the demographic you'll be teaching to. There might be some small farm towns you end up in that maybe that's not true, but
that's where I am.
Nonetheless, each student is individual. You're absolutely correct. So I think the best advice I can give for this would be understanding that even though instruction and assessment are very closely linked, like they're attached at the hip, they are not the same thing. So, and it also depends how hard and fast these objectives are. I mean, like if you're a teacher who's using high stakes testing, you're probably behind the times. Or if you see a teacher using high stakes testing, like some schools will make you write final exams. They'll make the students write final exams. So if that's your reality, you just have to go into that knowing that form of assessing has proven to have negative effects on learning. So that is something where you sort of have to manage the moral dilemma. But in your day-to-day teaching, I think it's super important to distinguish that assessment and instruction are connected, but they're very different. And instruction can be differentiated. So I think to answer your question, to acknowledge the diversity of students, but still grade everybody objectively, it starts with the instruction. So indicators, for example, they offer quite a bit of flexibility for differentiating instruction in the curriculum to allow students to arrive at the same standards. So paying close attention to those will definitely be to your benefit. Like I said to the last question, communication, ongoing constant formative assessment is also very helpful because you can't diagnose student needs without knowing the learner and how they learn. So being very just cognizant of who your students are as people and how they learn as learners is tremendously important to catering to that diversity, like you said, and then instructing to it. And then your instruction allows them to arrive at the same assessment standards. So if you're wondering, okay, well, what do you mean by differentiated instruction? There are a bunch of tips in the curriculum. I'm sure you've already had a class covering differentiated instruction, but it can be as simple as like conversations with the student. It can be as simple as scaffolding bigger assignments. It might be offering an additional formative task to the students if time permits. It might be giving the student more time, something like that. Anything where you can just cater to the student's learning style, that will allow you to have them arrive at the same assessment standards. And then depending what that standard is, like if it's just to demonstrate that they know something, if it's not procedural, but rather they just have to demonstrate that they know something, well, it doesn't have to be an essay. They could tell it to you, they could present it to you, they could sing it to you for all you know, like for all you care. As long as they're delivering that information that you need. If they have to show you how to do something, then that's a little bit different story. But I think that differentiating instruction is a good way to arrive at that the same assessment standards. Yeah, so professional judgment is a lot of the job, making those tough decisions. And to be honest, like whatever school you're in, they will probably have what's called, well, in my division, they're called RTI meetings. And so it's response to intervention meetings. And they sort of bring out the cumulative folder for at-risk students. And any student on that list, they bring in the teachers of those students for that semester, sit them down in a room, and they say, here are your students, you'll be teaching them this class, here's what we've seen in the past, here's some strategies that have worked. this is what you can offer to them. And then as you build your own relationship, you'll find out that, well, actually those strategies don't work for me and this student. We built new ones, update the cumulative file, and then you sort of keep this running record, and you stay informed. Like the school will keep you informed. You're not just plopped with all these students and you have to figure them out for yourself, but certainly making those connections to the students helps you make professional judgments about what will be best for them. Like, to give you an example, I had a student one year that really struggled with writing. 55 minutes or whatever it was just wasn't enough time for him to process instructions, generate ideas, and get them on paper. So I took time out of my day. I met with him 2 mornings a week, Tuesdays, Thursdays, for an hour before school even started. So he showed up at 7:30. I showed up at 7:30. We met in the library. That's 2 extra hours of learning, right? Where he just has time to get that stuff done. So now you haven't interrupted the class or anything like that, but it's just what worked for me and that student, and he ended up getting the credit. So it is worthwhile to make those professional calls. Yep. Yeah, for sure. That's a great question, because feedback can't all be rainbows and sunshine. You've probably been told to put the red pen away. I mean, that's up to you. I used whatever color a pen was sitting on my desk. It didn't really matter. But the short answer, I'm going to keep saying this, I sound like a broken record, but the short answer is the kids have to trust you. So it comes back to relationships. I mean, if the kids trust you and they know that you have their best interest at heart, they're more inclined to receive your feedback. So the strategy that I always used in my classrooms was I made a point of acknowledging something they're doing correctly up to the mistake. So like if they're going on the wrong path, for example, I'll say, all right, you've done all of this correctly. This is great. I see how you got this, right? So their mistake is justified. Like I'm trying to sort of come with them on their learning. I'll say, okay, I understand how you got this, but if you look at it this way, and then that's where you sort of offer the guidance. You also have to be very critical of yourself. So acknowledge that the error may be in your instruction. Maybe it's in your delivery. Maybe your instructions were confusing to the student. You might have to find another way to provide feedback for that student. But most importantly, the feedback, whether it's positive or negative, it needs to be timely. If it's too late, it doesn't matter if it's positive or negative, it's a waste of time. So it needs to be timely. And that's why I said circulating in the classroom is super important, because giving them that real-time feedback, it's way more encouraging for them, because then their submissions receive better results because they didn't have to get graded to get that feedback. They just needed to talk to you, So having it be timely is definitely the most effective strategy that I can give you. But in terms of it being constructive, I think just having the students' trust is a huge part of it, and making sure that it's timely and it's relevant to what they're doing, and sort of just jumping along with them in their learning process instead of saying, I'm the teacher, this is what you're supposed to, like, you have to try and bridge that gap between you being the teacher and them being the learner. And so, yeah, coming down to their learning level, saying, I understand how you got here. This is the direction we sort of want to go. Okay, this is a good one, because I teach history, and that's a huge problem in history in the past. I don't know if any of you are history teachers, but yeah, that used to be a huge issue, is that in history classes, once upon a time anyway, you might still see it. I know I've seen it in recent history classrooms. It was basically a textbook was authored, and then students were asked to just tell the teacher what the textbook said, basically. So you tell me how that's learning. But ultimately, this depends on what you teach. So, for instance, a PE teacher's assessment of praxis will be much different than an English or a history teacher's assessment of praxis. But in any case, your assessment of practical application should be able to definitively answer the question, has the student demonstrated the outcome? It needs to answer that. Since my teaching background is English and history, I can sort of speak from those. Like I said, in English, I found scaffolding to be a really effective way to assess practical applications, and it's mostly because practical applications in English are massive projects. It's crafting arguments and ideas, it's writing essays, it's defending positions, it's analyzing meaning, it's drawing connections. So if I can break those down into smaller components, I'm able to more accurately assess their practical application of the bigger picture. And therefore, they're receiving more feedback of each component of the practical application. So then when it comes to them actually demonstrating it for summative purposes, I already have a pretty good trail of formative assessment for me to inform my summative assessment. In history, I started implementing what's called historical thinking. Surely you've heard of this. If you haven't, I'm sure you will soon. Historical thinking elements became the practical foundation for what students were assessed from in my history class. So doing so meant that the practical application became students working through historical events by discovering them for themselves in a way. So instead of saying, this happened, then this happened, then this happened, then this happened, the objective is a little more to research how those historical events bleed into one another. Cause and causation, effect, things like that, historical significance. So the assessment was way more rooted in research and exploration of history rather than some retelling of a textbook. But in both cases, I avoid the close-ended questionings, so the who, what, where, when, and I assess to the open-ended problem solving, the why and the how. But again, it depends on the outcome that you're assessing. And in general, I think that student choice is also hugely important to assessing praxis if you can manage it, because student choice just positions the student to be more comfortable with whatever they're learning and meeting that outcome. But like I said, if you're a PE teacher and you're assessing sending and receiving, it needs to look a certain way. It needs to be done a certain way. But in some other classes, there's a lot of flexibility as to how you do that practical application, but assess the open-ended things and use the close-ended things as a way to get to the open-ended assessment, if that makes sense. All of it. You should put all of the effort into rubrics. The reason I say that is because rubrics and the criteria within rubrics are the most important link between the instruction and valid and reliable assessment. So you can be the best instructor in the world, but if your rubric is not clear and the students don't know what they're being assessed on, you're going to get a million different things, because interpretation is very open-ended. So your instruction, I'm sure you've discussed the backwards design model already. So the way that you build a great rubric is from the outcome. So you have to clearly say, what outcome do I have to meet? And as I'm sure you know, some of those outcomes aren't worded in very student-friendly language. You can get away with it a lot more at the high school level, like grade 11 and 12. But for the young ones, you have to first convert that outcome into student-friendly language. As soon as it says, I am going to know this, I am going to do this, whatever the outcome is, that is your starting point. And whatever the verbs are in that outcome, that's really what the student needs to be able to do. So for instance, to just borrow from English, because I'm one trick pony, if their objective is to write an essay and argue a certain position, defend a position, let's say. Two of the big parts of that rubric are going to be writing and defending, because those are the verbs that the rubric is asking of me. I'll just go back to PE because it's drastically different from the English curricula. If a kid is asked to send and receive, throwing, right? Throwing should be on my rubric because that is the verb that they are asked to do. So building it out of those verbs of the rubric is definitely the starting point. And then it depends how far down the unit a rubric is. So there are only a few things that I would probably carry through from the start to the finish, but your rubrics can evolve as you move through a unit, depending what you're working on. So I'm thinking of if you're scaffolding writing, for example, you would start with some more syntax heavy objectives in earlier assignments perhaps, but towards the end, the syntax is worth less or nothing. And it's more about construction of the argument, where you have certain things positioned within an essay. So the way that it develops as well is important, but building out of the outcomes and the indicators is a must, because the criteria need to make certain that every student is meeting the outcome if they follow that rubric. And so what you're going to find is that, kids know as soon as you give them the rubric, like if you give them an assignment and it doesn't have a rubric, kids now, like in today's classrooms, will say, is there a rubric for this? And if they don't ask, their parents are going to ask, where's the rubric for this? How do they know what they're being graded on? So everything that you summatively assess anyway has to have a rubric, and it shouldn't be given to them with their assessment. It should be given to them with the instructions. You should say, here's how you do the assignment. Here's a sample, a demonstration. Here's the rubric. And what you'll notice is they put the rubric here and they put the assignment here, and they're looking off the rubric all the time, using it as a checklist. And if you're teaching them to do that, you're setting them up for success because they're learning to the outcome, right? You've built that out of the outcome. Your instructions are built out of the rubric, which are built out of the outcome. Therefore, the student's learning is now built out of the instruction, which is directly connected back to the outcomes that you built the rubric out of. So you're constantly giving yourself that sort of reassurance that everything you're doing is to the curriculum, which is your job, right? If you're not teaching to the curriculum, you're not doing your job, not totally anyways. Another great way to build rubrics, and I wouldn't do this all the time because it might be time consuming, but involve the students. Have them help you build the criteria for a rubric. So if you tell them, here's the outcome we need to meet today, here are 10 ways that we can meet this outcome. What are the 4 or 5 that we think are the best for this assignment? What are the 4 or 5 criteria that we think are appropriate to meeting this outcome, and why? So involving the kids in building the rubrics is an awesome way, again, to get them to buy in, to invest in their learning. If they feel like they're a part of making and developing their learning, they're way more inclined to buy in to do the learning, right? Because if they've been a part of it from step one, they're now, like, you've removed that step between them doing the assignment and them seeing what the final goal is in the rubric. Instead, they're looking at the rubric and building their way down to the assignment. And so they can sort of see the learning in the rearview mirror and remember being there. So yeah, involving them in developing rubrics is also a great way, but that has to be done very carefully because it takes a lot of guidance. It has to be very teacher driven until they know exactly what rubric making is all about. So you have to sort of have it pre-made for them and just allow them the choice of picking criteria, that kind of thing.